Good evening, welcome to Today interview with Bilgute Tumundimril. Today we have invited United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation, Mr. Leo Heller, in the studio to talk about human rights to water and sanitation and the situation in Mongolia. So, sir, what is the position in United Nations, the Special Rapporteur, when it comes to human rights to water and sanitation?
Yeah. Firstly, there is the Human Rights Council that is part of the UN structure, and the Human Rights Council appoints what we call special procedures that are special rapporteurs and other independent experts to deal with the human rights on several areas, several aspects. There are a group of special rapporteurs that deal with what we call economic, social and cultural rights. So I am part of this group because water and sanitation is considered economic and social right, and together with other colleagues as the Special Rapporteur on housing, health, education.
How many are there?
We are around 60.
Around 60?
Yeah, the special procedures. Yeah, we are around 60. Yeah, obviously I'm the only one on water and sanitation.
Water and sanitation. So what was your mission? You've been here in Mongolia on your mission almost 2 weeks now. So what's the mission to come here in Mongolia from the United Nations?
Yeah, the country missions are one of the activities we undertake. We also do thematic reports and communications to governments. And this is my first mission in 2018. And I'm here in Mongolia for 2 weeks, as you said. And the idea of the mission is to assess the situation of the human rights, water and sanitation in the country, the bottlenecks, what needs to be done, and to deliver some recommendations for the government. So this was what I have done during these 2 weeks. And then I met several government agencies, ministries, Gazi, Ulaanbaatar provider, Uzug. I had meetings with civil society, NGOs. I went to several places to see and to talk to the people and to go to inside their houses when possible. I talked to a nomadic family, for instance. I traveled to the south, South Gobi, and then I went to some slums, talking to local authorities. And this is the way as we undertake the missions. Also reading documents, academic papers, in order to cross the several sources and have an idea, the best idea as possible in this short period of the situation of the human rights in the country.
So in a way you help the government or the state to make policies. Is that right? To make policies. You contribute your studies and your experience in the making of the policy when it comes to water and sanitation. Is that it?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Of course, it is an assessment, and assessment, of course, can have some criticisms. But we try to be as constructive as possible, delivering recommendations. The recommendations is a very important part of the mission, because this is a way that the government can take and can adapt and can follow. And it's also, our reports are also documents for the civil society to follow up, to encourage the government to do differently, if it's the case. So I would say yes, the idea is to support, to help the government to do better.
To do better.
Yeah.
Well, now let's go into the real problem where we need to talk about. What is the situation in Mongolia when it comes to human rights to water and sanitation? And I want you to be honest.
Okay, I'm always honest.
Okay.
Yeah. When we assess a country through the human rights perspective, through the human rights lens, something that is always very relevant to assess are inequalities in the access to water and sanitation. And here in Mongolia, my view is that inequalities are very, very large.
Very
we
large.
have a very important gap between different groups.
Mm-hmm.
So in my statement and in my future report,
Mm-hmm.
I am addressing that, showing different dimensions of inequality in the access to water and sanitation here.
Mm-hmm.
One dimension is the difference between the urban and rural population.
Mm-hmm.
The other dimension is the difference between the GARE areas and the non-GARE areas, the apartment areas, as we can mention. Other dimension is about schools. We have different situations in schools. I visited a number of them. The other dimension is about how the nomadic population have access to water and sanitation. And I'm also mentioning disabilities, people with disabilities, how they are provided with services.
Exactly.
If I can, I may choose one of these 5 dimensions to explore. I would say that the difference between GARE areas and non-GARE areas are very strong. And there are several layers of inequalities when we look at the GARE areas and compare with the non-GARE areas. One layer is the consumption of water. It's very lower. The consumption of water in the GARE areas are very lower than the standard, international standards, the minimum international standard. As I identified, the consumption is around, I would say, 7 to maximum 15 liters per capita day. That's very low. And in apartments...
What's the international standard?
I would say that 20 is the minimum.
Minimum.
Yeah, 20 is considered a consumption with high risk of health impacts, very high risks of health impact. And some people told us that in apartments area here in Ulaanbaatar, the consumption can be as high as 200 liters.
Yes.
So this is one of the dimensions. A second dimension is the price people in the GARE areas pay to access, not only to buy water from the kiosks, sometimes private kiosks, but also to pay to shower. They usually go to private shower places, and also to dig pit latrines. When the pit latrine is full, they need to contract someone to dig another latrines. So, and there are what we call non-monetary costs. Time is a non-monetary cost.
Yes.
And if you live in an apartment in Ulaanbaatar, you don't need to take time to fetch water, collect, transport water, store water, and to go to outside toilet. So.
And now, I'm sure there are other nomadic countries or nations, or not only nomadic, other countries that have similar situation with Mongolia. Are there any other countries have similar situations from your experience?
Yeah, I would say that inequality is very common in all the countries. Usually there is a huge gap between urban and rural population. There is usually a huge gap when you compare different wealth quintiles, wealth layers, and there are also differences when you compare different ethnic groups, religions, etc. And so, unfortunately, inequality is something that water and sanitation in several countries, even in developed countries, happens.
My next question is that, okay, we have a situation and we need a solution. And is there any kind of example of other countries that have decided on something and they have managed to do that change in when it comes to rights to water and sanitation?
Yeah, I would say that there is a diversified types of structure to address the access to water and sanitation. But something that I strongly believe is that when you have legislation and policies and institutional arrangements oriented by the human rights framework, things will be different. So some elements of the access of water and sanitation will be more visible when you look through the human rights framework. So, for instance, inequality from GARE and non-GARE areas here in Mongolia, I think is not so visible some people take it for granted that Gare should always have kiosks and pit latrines. But if you look at that situation through this lens of the human rights, this will not be so natural. People will be aware, people, I'm including the government, would be aware that something needs to be done to fix the problem in the Gare areas. And there are other elements that the human rights approach would bring: the right information, the right to participation, what we call the progressive realization. So it's important to go step by step in order to have a full compliance with the human rights. So this is, I would say, one of the key messages of my mission here.
Yes. If I ask you to advise us a one step, the first step for better change, for good change, positive change in this situation, what would that be?
Can I speak on two, not
okay,
one?
yes, please. Even
one,
better.
One is too few.
Even better.
Yeah. The first recommendation I'm giving is exactly to align legislation, institutional structure, policies with human rights. I think this is strong. This will change the different ways as the government is looking at the sector. Secondly, I would say that there is a need that water and sanitation have a better position in the government. Water and sanitation is very diluted in government policies. Usually is diluted under water resources management policies. It's very scattered between several ministries. You have a ministry that is in charge of building, the Ministry of
So it's very hard to point out who is in charge.
Who is in charge? There is a very weak coordination, if I can summarize. So I think it's necessary to have a change in this structure, because water and sanitation is very, very relevant. It's a very social problem here,
exactly.
a relevant social problem that needs to be addressed properly.
Well, you are an individual, I'm an individual. I want to talk about behavioral change. Okay, we have talked about, from the government perspective, government should do this and that. But in the individual level, what should we do to have equal human rights to water and sanitation? What a person can do.
Yeah, of course. I always put in the government shoulders the responsibility to provide resources for the people. Because usually, for instance, if I live in a Gare, I have few resources to change my situation, because the government is very absent. So, but of course, there are some small things that individuals can do. Individuals should not waste water. They should save water. It's not fair if someone in an apartment is wasting a lot of water and water is lacking for Gare areas. In the Gare areas, it would be important to build better pit latrines. I found that the pit latrines in the Gare areas are very unsafe for health, for the environment also.
Very
but it's not only up to the people to improve their latrines. They need money, they need advice. So the government should be present in these situations.
Government should be present in the Gare districts, Gare areas.
Yeah, I think this is a good message, a good summary.
Okay, well, thank you very much, sir, for very interesting aspects and interesting advices to our government.
Thank you, I appreciate it a lot.
Yes, and good luck and
you.
good health to you.
Thank you.
That's all for today. Thank you for staying with us. We will see you next Tuesday with more news and updates. Have a good one. Goodbye.